And here we go. So today it's probably going to be a little bit of a sleepier lecture for me because I am feeling like a sleepy human being today. And I'm also, as you can see, not in my own room. So I'm navigating my environment in someone else's room, which is unusual. Today we are going to dabble in a ton of different little topics, all of which are kind of like representative of like a larger theme that we're going to go into. So today we're looking predominantly at interactions between substances, the legality of different substances around the globe, and then also getting in kind of a little smattering of the beginnings of some larger topical threads that we're going to come back to later that are more touching on things that are a bit more complicated, etc. Okay, let's get started. What are some neurotransmitters? You can yell them out or put them in the chat. Name some neurotransmitters. I see glutamate in all caps. What else? GABA, yes. What else? Serotonin. There's a whole bunch. What are we missing? Noradrenaline, otherwise known as norepinephrine. Dopamine. That's right. Okay. I think that's most of them. So we got dopamine, norepinephrine, which is fight or flight, GABA, which is your natural anti-anxiety response. I'm gonna have to burp. You know, burping yourself really works. There's a reason that babies dig this shit. It's really effective. Serotonin, which is often, acetylcholine. Yes, we didn't quite touch on that one yet. Also, please make sure you're muted if you are not already. I can hear someone's stuff rustling around. Glutamate, which is a communication facilitating neurotransmitter, naturally occurring opioids like endorphins and cannabinoids. Endocannabinoids are also neurotransmitters. What is the opposite of an agonist? Antagonist. I think it's really funny watching these videos in retrospect because it looks like I'm just answering my own question, but I do have the chat open. I am actually reading people's answers. Opposite of something that is inhibitory. Remember, inhibitory is kind of like, it does not perpetuate a signal. It reduces signaling inside the brain. Excitatory, that's right. Excitatory increases, facilitates communication within the brain and body. So that would be glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. What is the opposite in effect as GABA? So remember, GABA reduces the amount of talking that the brain is doing to itself. What is the opposite of that? Glutamate, that's right. Alexis and Charles are killing it. And what is the opposite of something that is endogenous, made within the body? It's interesting that both of you spelled it endogenous, but it's exogenous. Yeah, exogenous is outside of the body. So like endo is inside, exo is outside, right? Like exoskeleton. Someone is not muted, and if you're not careful, I'm gonna have to come around and find who you are and mute you myself. So mute your mic. What kind of glutamate receptor do dissociatives bind to? The specific kind of receptor, I'm gonna have to go around and mute people. That's right, the NMDA receptor. It's fun to party with NMDA. That's a specific kind of glutamate receptor that dissociatives are particularly fond of. So if you see that something is a glutamate receptor antagonist, then specifically the NMDA receptor antagonist, it will probably be reducing the effects or effectiveness of glutamate at that receptor, which is a good indicator of what the drug does. What does it mean if something is a serotonin agonist? What would that substance do to serotonin? I'm gonna get you one way or another. I'm gonna find you. I'm gonna mute you. Haha, I found you. Ha 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 ha. Okay, we're back. Yes, okay, so I see a couple different answers in here. If something is a serotonin agonist, it increases the effects of serotonin. And it can do this in a couple of different ways. And today is when we'll talk about what those different ways are. So it's not as simple as a serotonin agonist will always just increase the amount of serotonin available in the synapse to do its thing. It's not always that simple. What category of substances increases the effects of GABA? And let me start by asking, what does GABA do? What is GABA's role? Calm. Yeah, that's easy. Calm. That's right. So GABA is your natural anti-anxiety response, right? So if you increase the levels of GABA or the effectiveness of GABA in the brain, you're going to feel calmer and more sedated, less central nervous system activity. So this is the class of depressants would be responsible for increasing the effects of GABA. Okay, anyone remember the term for loss of oxygen? And this often comes in the form of your extremities getting a blue tint, or for people with darker skin, a kind of grayish, whitish tint. Anyone remember what this is called? It's a medical term, starts with an H. Yes, hypoxia, that's correct. So anemia is lack of iron in the blood. Hypoxia is when you don't have enough circulation of oxygen to reach your extremities. So they kind of turn blue. And now this is sometimes found with certain inhalants if someone is not getting enough oxygen, like if you put a bag over your head and you got a hose leading to a tank of nitrous, you might lose oxygen in your extremities. 0 out of 10, would not recommend that. What is the word for skin picking and itching? It's not psoriasis, although that is, I mean, like, so. In response to your comment about anemia is, oh my God, I want to speak confidently on this, but God, I just don't know enough about anemia. I just don't know enough about it. Okay, so skin picking and
Pruritus.
pruritus. Thank you. You got it. Pruritus. That's right. Whoops. And which two categories might cause pruritus, skin picking and itching predominantly? Two categories.
Opiates and stimulants.
Exactly. That's correct. And then what about, I don't even remember what this one is. Oh yeah, this analgesia, pain relief. It was a busy day today. I didn't have a lot of time beforehand. So analgesia is pain relief, right? It's a reduction in signaling between things that are receiving pain and things that are processing pain. So substances like opioids produce analgesia, as well as depressants, as well as dissociatives. And these often will have the crossroads. Yes, thank you for clarifying on anemia. I knew that it was iron deficiency, but that's as far as my slow, sad, sleepy little brain could take it today. So thank you for filling in the blanks. Pruritus is not necessarily specific to using. People can have skin picking and itching for other reasons. However, this is a specific kind of product of certain kinds of like chronic and usually higher dose use of particular substances. Yeah. Okay. There is the presynaptic neuron. That's right. So we have the presynaptic neuron, which is the neuron that sends its signals to the next neuron. Am I roboting? Uh-oh. Oh no. Am I good now? Okay, sweet. So we have the presynaptic neuron. Sorry about the signal. Again, this is not my room. I just have so little control. Presynaptic neuron is what releases chemical signaling to the next neuron. So this is the foot that has little fingertips touching the bottom of it, tickling the bottom of it, right? So this is the one that contains the neurotransmitters, which are packaged in these little bubbles that are called vesicles, but we don't care about that. It sounds like testicles, so you can remember they're like balls. Oh, sorry about that. And then postsynaptic neuron is where the firing happens. So we have the presynaptic neuron, electricity shoots through it, pops the bubbles or whatever is happening. They come out into the synapse, they bind at the hot dogs, they fit in like keys in locks. They open the locks or not, and electricity continues or not. And it's very complicated. It's not just like that. This is the synapse. Remember, this is where the magic happens. This is the space between two neurons where chemicals will float and then do their thing as they bind at receptors right here. Okay. So just as a quick recap, and also giving a little bit more information about agonists and antagonists. An agonist increases the effects of a neurotransmitter. Whatever that neurotransmitter is, an agonist will increase its effects. On the other side of the coin is an antagonist, which will decrease the effect or effectiveness of a neurotransmitter. Now, we'd previously just kind of left it at that, but today I want to get a little bit more into it so we understand exactly how that might work. Now, there are three main ways that we'll talk about for each of them, and there are more than that. There are a lot of different ways that this can happen that involve proteins and protein coupled receptors and crazy shit that is way too advanced for this course. But one of the first ways is mimicry, right? We have a substance that looks like a neurotransmitter, so it can disguise itself as that key, stick it into the lock, and make that lock do whatever that neurotransmitter would have done to the lock. So it basically goes in and hijacks that operation. Then the next thing that it can do is stimulate the release or the production of that neurotransmitter so that there is more of it available in circulation to do its thing, or it could engage in reuptake inhibition. And we're going to come back to this concept in a little bit, but this is one of the major ways, reuptake inhibition, that substances can exert an agonist effect. Please make sure to mute yourself if you are not muted already. Okay, antagonists on the other side of the coin instead could block a receptor, so prevent a neurotransmitter from doing what it would do. The key cannot get into the lock. You cannot pass go and collect $200. Thank you for the visuals. I spent most of my time finding them in this course. The other is to decrease the production of certain neurotransmitters. So there are fewer of them in circulation to do their thing, or they're just like not being made as effectively, or increasing reuptake. So there's more reuptake happening. And again, we'll come back to what that means in just a little bit. So in terms of inhibition and excitation, an inhibitory neurotransmitter is one that reduces the amount of signaling happening in the brain. So if a neurotransmitter is inhibitory, and the only inhibitory neurotransmitter we're going to talk about is GABA, it's the main inhibitory neurotransmitter. So if you see or hear the acronym, I guess, word GABA used somewhere, you can immediately know, okay, it's inhibitory, it's reducing signaling within the brain, which means that it's probably going to be dampening something. And then opposite of that is an excitatory neurotransmitter. It facilitates communication, it increases communication. So the primary excitatory neurotransmitter is glutamate. So inhibitory, GABA, excitatory, glutamate. We're not going to talk about anything else that could have inhibitory or excitatory effects. If I say it's an excitatory neurotransmitter, I'm talking about glutamate. If I say it's inhibitory, I'm talking about GABA. This is just kind of good to know, okay? Oh, I just kind of noticed that my internet connection is unstable. So inhibition slows or stops the flow of signaling. I'm roboting. Oh, that's sad. I'm sorry, guys. I wish there was something I could do about it. And then there's excitation, which increases the flow of signaling. And I'm not going to talk about action potentials, but that's the gist of it, is basically if it's inhibiting it, less of it is occurring, or it's less effective at occurring. If it's exciting it, more of it is occurring, or it's more effective at occurring. So just to make this, yeah, I could turn off my camera, but that's so sad and uncomfortable. How bad is it? Rate it in the chat. How robot-y am I? 3 out of 10, 5 out of 10 bad, 71 out of 2. Mild to medium spicy.
That was 7.5.
Oh, that's sad. Okay. I'm going to switch over to my hotspot. I think that my housemate might be on the Wi-Fi. So give me just a second. It might boot you guys out. Just hang on. Okay, I'm back. How are we doing? Am I better? Thank you so much. Welcome back to me too. Okay, smooth sailing. Cool. Let's resume then. So just to make sure we have this concept very clear, if we have agonist, we can replace it with increased in terms of whatever neurotransmitter is acting on. If we have antagonist, we can replace it with decreased, to make this very, very clear, okay? So if we have a GABA agonist, make sure to mute yourself, please. If you have a GABA agonist, you can replace that with GABA increased, right? Uh-oh, I'm lagging. Oh no. Can you guys hear me? Oh, I'm frozen. That sucks. Everything is whatever. Okay, cool. Okay, so That's a really nice still of me that you have. That's great. Cool. So GABA is increased, and if GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, that means that GABA's inhibitory effects are increased by an agonist, okay? So that is where it gets sticky, right? You have, if something is a GABA agonist, it means that GABA is increased, but GABA is inhibitory. So its inhibitory effects are increased by an agonist, which means that there is more inhibition happening. I'm going to stop my video and turn it back on again because oh, that was so easy. God, I have a computer science degree. Anyway, okay, dopamine is responsible for regulating what two things? Is there a substance that acts as a GABA antagonist? Yeah, I don't know what they are off the top of my head. I'm sure they exist. It's not that common. It's not an effect that's usually a prominent effect of most recreational illicit substances. Ergo, I'm not as familiar with it. You can know a lot about a lot of things, but you can't know everything about everything. So I know a lot about a lot of things, but not about everything. Yes, okay, I see motor control, and what do you think the R word is? Reward, that's right. Okay, reward and motor control are regulated by dopamine. Dopamine agonist, what the effects of dopamine increases or decreases? If it's an agonist, it increases or decreases the effects.
Increases.
Okay, meaning that the person who is taking a dopamine agonist feels what kind of way? Good, question mark? Pretty good. Yeah, I'm liking these answers. Pretty nice, man. GABA antagonists are used to reverse benzo overdoses. Thank you very much. Interesting. Yes, so more reward feeling, things feel good. So what is an example of a dopamine agonist? Any example? Cocaine, question mark? Yes, cocaine, Adderall, petting cats. That's also correct. In some cases, for many people, a dopamine agonist might be sex, or if you're, you know, me researching substances, I put meth, but yeah. Adderall is indeed a dopamine agonist. Yes, that's correct. 4FA is also a dopamine agonist. 2FMA is also a dopamine. All right, yeah, now we're just showing off here, which is fine. That's great. I love it. One category of drugs involving dopamine agonists, therefore, might be what?
Stimulants.
That's right. Also, do not feel even worse about having ADHD, please. It's like dopamine agonism is lit. Like, wow, so awesome. You feel more rewarded about this stuff. LSD is a minor dopamine agonist, but not to like a massive extent. And yes, stimulants, generally speaking, are the category that are highly impacted by dopamine, although many other substances have some kind of dopaminergic effect as well. Okay, so it's a bit late for me to be saying this, but generally I want to just define the term psychoactive. A psychoactive is a substance that when ingested affects mental processes. So for instance, ibuprofen, even though it is a drug, is not a psychoactive because it doesn't affect your mental processes. So when I say a psychoactive substance, I mean something that influences the way that you act and perceive and whatever. And this can mean a lot of different things. And some people define this more broadly than others, but I'm going to generally say that if a drug makes you think differently or feel differently, mostly like how you process differently, it's a psychoactive. So other words for this might be a psychopharmaceutical or a psychotropic. These all mean the same thing, although psychopharmaceutical often is used to refer specifically to prescription substances that make you feel like mentally different. Now, just to get kind of quick and dirty into some major drug interactions, these are the big boys, right? There are so many minor drug interactions. I wish that we had time in this course to really get into them because it's so complicated. It's never as simple as being like, well, lamictal interact with MDMA. It requires like 100 different tabs and me researching frantically for 30 minutes to give you a good answer because there's so much that goes into it. So it takes a lot of time to really identify interactions. Reddit is not a lab, so like please be mindful when you're looking up interactions on Reddit. I have seen some heinous misinformation presented so eloquently that it's like amazing. I'm like, wow, that's awesome and really scary. So please be mindful. Oh, look, the Tripsit interactions chart. Well said. So yeah, I've fallen for that before also, honestly. So this is the most recent, I believe, Tripsit interactions chart. Now this is where on the chart things start to get kind of sticky looking, right? You see a lot of red happening. It's a lot of warm colors, one might say. So tripsit.me is an excellent resource. And MXC on the board, yeah, I know. DMXC is a new one for those of you, again, on Reddit who've probably seen that if you're interested in dissociatives. So you can see HXC released yesterday. Man, it's like there's like a top 100 billboard chart where you can see the most popular research dissociatives. So you can see that for most of these, where you get the red, where you get like hefty interaction where it could be really risky, a lot of these substances are depressant-like or opioid-like. Because one of the major risks of both of those classes is respiratory depression, slowing your heart rate, slowing your or lowering your blood pressure, and mixing that compounds those effects, as we'll see in just a second, but this is a great resource. Now, two of these on here that also have a ton of different interactions and are a little bit different are MAOIs and SSRIs, which we'll come back to in much more detail later. Now, real quick, okay, what is an example of a benzodiazepine?
Xanax.
Xanax, woo, that's the one I use. So if you are combining two substances that both increase the effects of GABA, then GABA is going to be drastically increased in its effects, right? Which can lead to a drastic lowering of your respiration and your blood pressure. All right, now you're just all listing research chemical benzos in the chat. Now we have depressants and opioids. Again, we have like heroin, for instance, over here and benzos over here. And each of these will have like slightly different ways that it does this, right? But both of them ultimately will decrease your respiration and your heart rate and your blood pressure, which kapow combined can lead to overall system depression. I don't mean mental depression, I mean functional depression, like your actual, you know, beady boy over here and your brainy guy up here slowing down in their processes. And that can be extremely risky. Okay. Now, depressants and dissociatives, I'm sure some of you have seen someone at some point in time who's combined ketamine and alcohol and has suffered the consequences. Now, what's interesting about mixing dissociatives and depressants is that many dissociatives aren't actually substantial decreasers of central nervous system activity in the same way that depressants and opioids are. And this is probably best exemplified by the fact that in emergency rooms, ketamine is often administered to people with head trauma because it isn't as much of a respiratory depressant as other substances. So while it definitely is a risk that, like, they do sedate you and depress your system for sure, but not quite to the extent that these other two classes, depressants and opioids, do. So I would say that one of the major risks with mixing depressants and dissociatives is puking and choking on it, or just like having such a lowered amount of like bodily movement and coherence that you are prone to injury. And that's not only the only risk, that's just like something that I think is commonly overlooked. So for instance, you have something like a depressant, which is increasing the effects of GABA, which calms your system. And then you have something like a dissociative like ketamine, which decreases the effects of glutamate, which decreases signaling within the system. So at the same time, you have this like anti-anxiety kind of calm reduction of activity as you do this reduction of signaling and communication between the brain and itself and the brain and the body, which generally will like globally, jobily reduce the amount of stuff happening. And that can be dangerous as fuck. And I've definitely seen some very pungent red wine flavored puke in several parking lots outside of a couple warehouse parties from people that have had this combination. The good thing about people that mix ketamine and alcohol is that usually 45 minutes of absolute writhing, puking hell later, they'll sit up and be like, oh, I want to go pee, and they're fine. It's not always that way, but that's like, it's really unpleasant and can be very dangerous. So like, don't downplay it, but know that people choking on their puke sucks. What exactly triggers the vomiting? Spins. Honestly, I would say that's like the main thing that would do it, because ketamine by itself can trigger spins, but let me warn you, mixing ketamine and alcohol really compounds the effects of both of them, and your ass is dizzy. Your vestibular system is confused. So be very, very careful of mixing ketamine and alcohol. We're talking like if you have 2 drinks and 1 bump of ketamine, that might be enough to make you extremely, extremely debilitatingly fucked up. Now, depressants and stimulants gets a little bit more interesting here. We have something like a depressant, like alcohol, that increases the effects of GABA, which reduces the level of anxiety or activity in your system. And then on the other side of the coin, you might have something like cocaine, which increases the effects of something like norepinephrine, your fight or flight. Now, the question is, what happens here? You have your system getting slowed down and simultaneously hyped up from multiple different directions. What happens? And the answer is we don't really always know. Now, that's what makes this combination kind of a sticky one, because sometimes this can just put a lot of strain on your cardiovascular system. You have so many mixed messages. It's like, I don't know what to do with all this, so I'm just going to do everything. And it's not generally something that can cause like massive risk if you're using small quantities of each. However, it's pretty easy to get into something like seizure mode depending on which depressant you're using. For instance, DXM is a serotonin agonist as well as a depressant. So if you mix it with a stimulant, and there's a possibility of having a seizure, but generally this is just kind of an unpredictable mixture. Now, here's where a lot of people aren't familiar with how this kind of thing can be riskier than they imagine. Let's say that we mix alcohol with cocaine. Does anyone know what the byproduct of that is? Yes, I see you, cocaethylene, that's right. So in your liver, when alcohol and cocaine mix, you get this third substance called cocaethylene, which makes your liver very, very sad. Now, cocaethylene is toxic. It's hepatotoxic, very not happy time inside of your body. And the thing about it is it creates its own unique recreational drug, right? Your body metabolizes cocaethylene and produces a unique effect that kind of mixes alcohol's euphoric sedation and cocaine's hyper desire to tell people things. Yeah, that's right. Hepatotoxic is for your liver. Cardiotoxic is your heart. So what's really important to take away from this is that sometimes it's not just straight up about these two drugs mix. These drugs are getting processed by so many different systems inside of your body, and you have to consider all of those systems when you think about what the end result will be. So for instance, here's just like an example of this that's kind of off the cuff. Some people who have OCD, for instance, have an exacerbation of their symptoms before they get their period in the premenstrual time period. And part of the reason for that is because serotonin signaling is affected by estradiol, which is impacted by, or it impacts dopamine down the line, because serotonin signaling impacts dopamine 3 steps away. And stuff like that is like, you really would have to know what you're doing to figure that out, but you have to look pretty far down these processes. So an example of this that a lot of people are totally unfamiliar with is the concept of enzyme inhibition. This is one of my favorite things to talk about because it really makes people think twice about their interactions, and that's very satisfying to me. So a prime example of this, well, first I'll explain. Enzyme inhibition is basically you have enzymes, right, in your liver that break down what goes through your body. They break it into little pieces, they gobble it up, they spit out these little smaller pieces that your body can process more easily, and they get excreted in some way. That's what usually happens. Now, if you introduce an enzyme inhibitor right here, a substrate is whatever the enzyme impacts, right? So a drug would be a substrate. If you introduce an enzyme inhibitor, it will block that process. It prevents the enzyme from gobbling up the drug and Pac-Manning it into little pieces that are more directly deal withable by your body. So because of this, you don't get that breakdown that you normally would. And this is relevant to drugs because certain enzyme families, like for instance, the CYP450 family, includes a bunch of enzymes that are responsible for breaking down certain drugs. So a prime example of this is the CYP3A4 enzyme. This is a specific enzyme that is found, or not that is found in, that breaks down things like SSRIs and MDMA, and I believe certain antipsychotics as well. And when you inhibit the action of that enzyme, you're not going to be able to break down those drugs as effectively. Now, can anyone think of a condition that might result from having too much of a serotonin producing or releasing or reuptake inhibiting drug in your system? Serotonin specifically. Yes, serotonin syndrome. I see you. Right. Exactly. So if you introduce something that inhibits the breakdown of those substances, specifically by inhibiting the CYP3A4 enzyme, then those drugs aren't going to get broken down as well. Now, Does anyone know a really major example of a CYP3A4 enzyme inhibitor? If this sounds like gibberish to you, don't worry. The answer is simpler than you think.
Is grapefruit juice?
Yes, grapefruit juice. And a lot of people are prescribed SSRIs, for instance, without being told. If you eat a shitload of grapefruit, you could probably be really uncomfortable. And it's just little stuff like that. So knowing about enzyme inhibition is very important because it can also inhibit the breakdown of other substances where you really could have a life-threatening overdose on them if they're not broken down, like certain opioids with the CYP2D6 enzyme, etc. So that's just something to think about. We'll come back to that maybe verbally later. I'm going too long.
I think there was a case where someone actually overdosed on CBD because they were taking grapefruit and another medication.
That's interesting. I think I actually heard about that. I don't know the details, but that sounds kind of familiar. I see someone says lemon tech. Now, lemon tech is actually not quite the same thing. Lemon tech is when you take, oh no, am I going to get too off track by saying this? I'll do it quickly. Basically, lemon tech is creating a little external stomach for yourself outside of your body by putting some lemon juice in a shot glass and soaking your ground up mushrooms in it for 20-25 minutes, and then drinking that, or even straining out the mushrooms and drinking it. But what's important to note about this is that the reason this works is that lemon juice has a specific pH that is pretty directly comparable to that of your stomach. So you're not actually potentiating anything. It's not making anything stronger. All that's happening is that the psilocybin, which is the inactive ingredient in mushrooms, is getting broken down into psilocin before it even hits your mouth. So your body doesn't have to do that. So you come up a lot faster and harder at the same time. And that makes people feel like they're tripping a lot harder when it's more just kind of condensed. And lemon tech trips can only last for like 3 to 4 hours. It's very short comparatively for a lot of people. So it's not the same. And this is a really major thing that is like, no, not any acidic substance could work. That's a common question. The reason being that you need a substance where the pH is comparable to your stomach. So you could use, I think, vinegar, like white vinegar maybe might be an adequate substitute. You can use lime juice as well, but grapefruit juice and orange juice aren't going to have the same effect. They're not the same pH. There'll be some breakdown, but not in the same way. And grapefruit juice is an enzyme inhibitor, more importantly, so it might extend the effects of mushrooms a little bit, but wouldn't necessarily potentiate them, you know? What I'm getting at here is it's very fucking complicated, and you really have to look up every specific unique thing. It's very hard to generalize with substances. It's so difficult. If substances like substance A were the same as substance B, they'd be called the same thing, and they would look and smell and taste and be and act the same. But they're not, they're different. And that's really important to keep in mind. Even with fruits, you know, like you wouldn't make like a grapefruit marinade for your chicken by swapping grapefruit out for lemon because they're not the same. So whenever people are like, oh, just swap out this fruit for another, it's like they're different fruits. They're not the same fruit. Just like meth is not amphetamine and vice versa. Ingesting grapefruit could prolong effects. I don't know the extent to which it would actually work that way. If it were that effective, I think it would be more commonly done, to be honest. I think that there would be maybe some minor potentiation. I'm not positive which enzyme breaks down psilocybin. I think it's CYP3A4. That's the thing. You'd have to look it up. Okay, so before I run out of all my time, reuptake real quick. So what we're looking at here, we have the neuron, the presynaptic neuron. Inside of these little bubbles, we have the neurotransmitters, right? Electricity comes down, pops the bubbles, neurotransmitters fly out, they plug themselves like locks into the, or keys into the locks, I always fuck that up, into the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. And now what's happening here is that these little guys right here, these transporters, basically are like, all right, party's over, you're coming home, and they bounce them, they suck them up like vacuums to be repackaged and used to see another day. Not all of the serotonin molecules or whatever the molecule is, not all of the neurotransmitters that bind, that get released, get sucked back up. A lot of them are like eaten by other substances floating and prowling in the void, like MAO, which we'll come back to later. But in this case, all we're looking at is the fact that these neurotransmitters are sucked up like vacuums and they are repackaged and recycled for future use. And that is really significant, because this process of removing them from the synapse makes it so they can't just hang out there and continuously bind and do their thing until they're eaten by something bigger that comes along and thinks they look delicious. The selective part, oh, off the top of my brain, oh my God, I know what the selective part of this is, but you threw me off, man. You threw me off. Oh God, long day. No, the selective part, I believe, is that it's like specific. No, you're good. I know what the answer to this is. I just cannot conjure it at this moment in time. If anyone remembers what selective refers to here.
Is it just that it has to do with just serotonin?
I don't think so. I think it's like something's, oh my God, I know this answer. Can you please email me and I will email everyone the answer to this, because this is definitely, or maybe it comes up in the next slide actually. Anyway, so this process is called reuptake. I should be specific in that the important part here is that it's an SRI, a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or an NRI, a norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. And I believe that the selective refers to only inhibiting certain types of reuptake for certain areas, but we'll get to that in a second. So what we're getting at here basically is that if something prevents reuptake, it means that it prevents these neurotransmitters from getting sucked back up and recycled. So they have more time to vibe out with their friends in the synapse and keep binding and doing their thing. Basically, more bang for your buck is how I would like to describe it. So transporters, reuptake, neurotransmitters. Yes, the transporters are the vacuums. They're the transporters are the things that are like, okay, kids, we're coming home, and they suck them back up and stick them back in their vesicle testicles, and everybody cheers. So an SSRI is a substance that is selective. That's what we're getting at here. It binds to a particular kind of serotonin receptor, or transporter. I'm pretty sure that should say transporter or receptor. Too tired for this. It acts on serotonin specifically. Reuptake is the process of sucking something back up and recycling it, and inhibition is preventing it, right? So if we have something that is a reuptake inhibitor, it prevents a neurotransmitter from getting sucked back up and repackaged. Why is this important, you might ask? Again, this means that if the reuptake is being inhibited, that means that there's more of the neurotransmitter available to do its thing. So does that mean that something like an SSRI is a serotonin agonist or antagonist? Yes, agonist, that's correct. So an agonist is something that increases the effects of a neurotransmitter. If we are increasing the amount of that neurotransmitter that's available for binding in the synapse to do its thing, make its effects happen, that means that it is an agonist, okay? Mazel tov on getting vaccinated. That is lit. Okay, quick peek into legality real quick. We're just gonna kind of get this out of the way because this is some of the gnarly history stuff that it's cool to know. This falls for me under the category of like, this gives you a springboard for if there's something you want to learn more about, you know what you need to look up and you know what exists to learn more about, because this is interesting stuff that a lot of people don't know about. All right, so there are 3 major treaties about substances and in the darkness bind them. The first being the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. Don't fall asleep during this history lesson. It is more interesting than you might think and very relevant. The next is the Convention on Psychotropic Substances, and then the third one has a really long name that I'm not even going to try and say. So the Single Convention in 1961 was the first major regulatory effort across the globe. And this was kind of done in response to a lot of concerns that were being had in the 50s and the beatnik era in particular, and after the World War II, there was a surge of drug use. And because of this, the United States in particular, as it always has done, spearheads this effort to be like, we all need to work together to destroy this threat that is substances. So these are international laws. These are conventions. That's why this is relevant, is that these are 3 international conventions that basically bring a ton of countries together and are like, let's have a plan for how we're going to do this together, like all of us. This is how we communicate with other countries. So it started off with us looking at morphine-like, cocaine-like, cannabis-like substances. And it's cool because you can kind of tell what the major drugs were during these time periods because of these conventions. So the idea behind this was to criminalize production, to make it harder for people to make and distribute substances, except for medical and therapeutic and research purposes. And what ended up happening here was that the participants in this convention ended up dividing themselves into caucuses. So basically splitting themselves up based on what they wanted out of this. So countries like the United States came in and we were like, okay, we want lots of regulations on the growers. We want there to be like strict stuff against people that grow coca leaves or opium plants or whatever. And then meanwhile, you had countries like Peru that were like, fuck you guys. Like, of course you want that because you don't have like a gross domestic product that is highly reliant on growing these substances. Of course you want them to be regulated. So we're going to bind together and try and push for international laws that support us, that make it so that it's actually the like labs that are more heavily criminalized than the growers, for instance. And this made it very clear immediately that this whole practice was largely based in economics. And that was really like a major root of this, was that everyone was like, fuck, man, I don't want this to be regulated. That's where my money comes from. You can't just tell me that I can't make my money off of this anymore. And this is socially and culturally important to us, etc. Not as severe as the Philippines. That's correct. It's not. The Philippines is really doing a number on drug users right now. Then 1971 rolls around, and who knows what this coincides with? Who is the man with the plan? Who 1971 is attached to? Who might be behind pushing?
Nixon.
That's right, Richard Nixon. Okay, so now you can kind of see again the drug trends as they evolve. In 1971, they were like, we have some additional substances to add to this platter of regulation. So they started regulating amphetamine type stimulants with this amazing stock photo to go with them, and then benzos and barbiturates and psychedelics. And this was around the Vietnam War. So there was a huge moral panic about psychedelics for reasons that we will come back to in great detail later. And then the third one, I made this meme and I thought it was so funny. And every year, like one person thinks it's super, super funny. If you're that person, like raise your hand in the chat because I want to be held by you. I think this is hilarious since, yeah. So the United Nations Convention Against Illicit Trafficking in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances was what came last. Yes, this was the one that was 1988, the Reagan era. And this was when we really started becoming even more narcissistic than before. So this was the convention where all of a sudden we had these laws that were attempting to regulate precursors. So it wasn't just about the drugs themselves. We were like, okay, not only can you not make these or sell them, but also you can't produce the substances that are used to make those substances. So this led to this massive web of regulation, and guess who profits off of that? And then also trying to shut down dealers internationally. So this was kind of like an international cooperative effort to be like, we are going to catch them as they travel between our borders. And then also encouraging countries to develop harsher possession laws. Now, the purpose of this was to shut down international organized crime using cooperation. So they said the actual purpose of this was to enforce racist rhetoric and protect internal economic interests, but that's too lengthy to say in a statement. It's easier to just say we're racist and we hate you. Yeah, we'll get back to MDMA synthesis. So currently we have, this is like updated as of 2018. It's an interesting website that has more information on this. Around the world, we have like a whole variety of different levels of decriminalization or legalization or heavy criminalization. So for instance, countries like Mexico have decrim going on, and countries like the Netherlands as well. And then you also have like we have sporadic weed laws in North America, et cetera, right? It's kind of all over the place. And meanwhile, here is kind of a general outline of the trafficking map. And I know this is really overwhelming to look at. It's just here so that you can get an idea for how major these trade routes are and how they really go all over the world. And what you'll notice is that a lot of the countries that are major manufacturers, major growers of substances, are often countries that will end up heavily relying on the income. This map, I believe, should be linked in the presenter notes. It should be somewhere around here. It's in the presenter notes. This is one where I didn't get around to fixing the presenter notes up. If not, email me and I will get you the link to it. But it's a great map, right? So it gives you a really good idea of where different substances are being produced and how much, and also where they're going to. So in many cases, we have wealthier countries that are able to import a lot of these substances, and countries with lower income per capita that are exporting these substances. And this is not a coincidence whatsoever at all. Thank you, Brian. So meanwhile, around the world, we have stimulants like khat in Ethiopia, a naturally occurring substance, or the kola nut in Nigeria, which are both stimulants that just occur in plants, right? And now here is, oh, now we have to go to YouTube. It's sad. An amazing, amazing documentary. I highly recommend it. It's called Cartel Land. It is extremely graphic and upsetting. Well worth watching. But here's a little bit of insight into why people make drugs. And this is something that is so often left out of the equation. We view dealers and suppliers as faceless entities that have people's worst interests in mind, when the reality is that the vast majority of people that grow and produce substances are doing so to escape from poverty and to attempt to provide for their communities. In fact, some of the most major cartel ringleaders in history have been considered community benefactors that have been well loved among the people that they've surrounded themselves with, who have built entire centers for deeply impoverished areas of their countries. We'll come back to all that later. An amazing documentary. It used to be on Netflix. It's not now. A lot of methamphetamine comes from Mexico. It's true. And this has caused enormous amounts of xenophobia. Enormous. And that is from the beginning, right? Like anywhere where drugs are coming in from, the immediate response is to be like, we need to shut the people that are bringing these substances in out because they are evil and they're corrupting our society and whatever other racist bullshit that they want to spew in that given moment. But the fact of the matter is that we have demand, enormous demand. We are the reason for the drug trade, like the US in particular, not to be Eurocentric, like the US in particular. Another major manufacturing route is amphetamine, which is more widely circulated within Europe. So again, these trafficking maps are really complicated. East Asia is also a major methamphetamine producer and trafficker. So those are probably the two biggest hotspots of production and trafficking. Yeah, Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia is so fun. So that's just kind of good to know. And then when you have something like cocaine, almost all of it is going to be produced near the Andes or in South America somewhere, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia in particular. Yeah, shabu. We're going to come to shabu and yaba, which are two different forms of methamphetamine in East and South Asia. Come back to that. Now, real quick about the US-Mexico border, La Frontera. This is a real can of worms.
So we got 3 packages that were... Have you ever crossed from Tijuana into San Diego?
Well, I have.
This is a guy that was a smuggler, and he's being interviewed right now by, I think, Playboy.
Indeed. The chief of police of Tijuana was my friend. And we used to sit at the bar in Tijuana and get totally lambasted. And we'd snort coke all night. And when we'd run out of coke, he'd send one of his bodyguard cops. He'd go call them over and say, go back to the station and get some coke. And they go back to the station and get into the locker and take out a bag of coke and bring it to us in the bar. You know, that's how it worked in Mexico. It took money.
Do you think you'd be able to successfully bring drugs from Tijuana into San Diego today?
If I wanted to, of course.
So a lot of this involves also a note about calling yaba evil pills. What I highly recommend doing is doing kind of an evaluation of how you communicate to yourself and others about drugs. Substances are inherently not animated. They are inert. Like this bed sheet that I'm sitting on right now is about as active as a substance when it's just doing its thing. What really, it literally means evil pills. Oh, okay, never mind. I'll save that speech for later then. But what I'm getting at is that the substance isn't necessarily the thing that really matters. What matters is the context of use. For some of you, that might involve reading Dr. Carl Hart's new book, Drug Use for Grownups, in which he, a very renowned professor and drug researcher, talks about his own drug use, including using heroin on a regular basis for 5 years and methamphetamine, like just kind of non-problematically with his wife. Like, what matters is the context of use. I cannot stress this enough. What matters is the context that you use the substances in. Just a quick interesting note. Oh, I'm going to run out of time today. That sucks. Quick interesting note about consumers of substances like ecstasy, MDMA, Molly, whatever you want to call it. We can see that it's predominantly in North America, Europe, Russia, and Oceania. And this is something that we will see more and more often, is that the more traditional recreational substances are usually consumed almost entirely by these 3 or 4 denominations. Now that's kind of interesting, is it? Like, Western countries are driving the drug trade because we eat the drugs at a higher rate than anybody else. So that's good to know and keep in mind. Now we'll come back to this whole issue of why regulating precursors doesn't necessarily work. For example, we'll come back to this later. I'm just going to touch on it briefly. This concept of making MDMA. Now, previously, we'd made MDMA by cutting down sassafras trees, which were endangered in the cardamom rainforests of Cambodia. And this led to a lot of poaching and problems, and also extreme deforestation that led to the almost entire destruction of the sassafras trees. Really big problem. So a way around this was we discovered that you could use PMK glycidate instead, which is a precursor. And now we're fighting to regulate PMK glycidate, and it's this whole ordeal. If you take away one method of producing something, you'll just get a different one. End of story. It will sometimes only take like 5 to 7 days for that different one to hit the market. Yep. Yeah, exactly. It's now banned in the Netherlands and new routes are already in use. And that's the case with so many different precursors. It's not just like this one, it's all kinds of stuff like Flocka, for instance, in Florida. There was this whole zombie drug craze and it was banned, and literally within 5 to 7 days, a new major cathinone, which we'll come back to and talk about what that is, hit the market. And it has a new set of toxicology effects and potential risks and benefits, and we don't know any of them. So it's just like, what's the fucking point? Now, yeah, we'll come back to the MDMA drought. There's a really interesting bit about that and DXM pills and PMA and PMMA, super interesting stuff. Depressants, things like kava, a naturally occurring substance in the Pacific Islands, or absinthe in Switzerland, just as examples of where these can show up in different areas. And in terms of alcohol, like this is probably not something we're going to talk about very much, but it's just still interesting to kind of note the regions where substances like alcohol are very prevalent and the cultural significance that that holds in some of those areas. In particular, we have really, really high rates of alcohol consumption in Europe and in the United States and in Russia and in Oceania. Does that sound familiar? Like, it's generally going to be those regions that are major consumers of substances. Damn, I'm out of time. I didn't do a good job of budgeting this time. Oh, because you guys have questions. All right, now let's take a look at Valiant in Scotland.
First thing I got asked when I stepped off the bus was, do you want any Valium? Wow. When I first started taking Valium, I used to take them out in the street and I'd end up going think that was invisible, I'd go shoplifting and stuff. But now, I get me Valium, I come back, I come to the house, I'll sit, I'll shut the door, and that's me. I do it the proper way. Whereas people do it the wrong way by just going around the town full of it, pension things and that. Well, I don't do that. I'm a beggar. Sitting there begging actually does give you a nice feeling. You sat there, you're not harming anybody, so they're willing to help you.
When did you first take Valium?
When I was about 13 years old. I was young, I might have been only 11.
How old are you now?
I'm 29.
Would you usually take 30, 40 Valium as well as smoking legal highs and taking methadone? Okay, so that's not unusual. Like many users, Levi was taking Valium with a combination of other drugs. This can be particularly dangerous, and the effects were really starting to show.
So the reason that I show videos like this is not because I want to give the impression that these substances are inherently worse drugs. That's very important for me to note. The reason that I show videos like this is because so often the deleterious impacts of people using substances is the context that they are using them in, right? Like if a 13-year-old is given Valium, what is the likelihood that that 13-year-old is going to have developed enough understanding of his or her, their own bodily functions, mental processes, needs, desires, any of those things to make decisions, informed consent decisions, right? So poverty and racism are the two biggest roots of every major problem pertaining to substances and the generational traumas that are incurred because of those things. It's vastly intersectional. I know I keep getting at this point. I want to continue building on this point until it's drilled home. This is the last slide we're going to look at. I am sad that I didn't get through an entire lecture today. I really don't like pushing back. But real quick, just as an immediate introduction to the concept of hallucinogens and the places that they're naturally occurring, I'm sure some of you are familiar with El Bufo, the Colorado river toad, which is found in the southwestern US predominantly, but also regions south of the border as well, I believe, in Mexico. That produces the naturally occurring substance 5-MeO-DMT, otherwise known as 5, and then also things like San Pedro cactus, which are naturally occurring and produce mescaline, and also grows in South America and regions of like Southern California and the Southwest. So this is just like a small teaser of what we're going to be getting into later in the class. I hope you guys have a fantastic evening. I'm going to dip out now so I can make myself chicken tikka masala. Was the toad ever used as an entheogen? Oh yeah. Yeah, it produces 5-MeO-DMT, and we will talk all about 5-MeO-DMT. Thank you guys for joining me this evening. Next week, we will finish this lecture and I think begin our first spotlight on psychedelics, possibly, or an MDMA. I don't remember which it is. So see you next week, and we can start going really deep into the individual categories of substances. Have a good night.
Well.
Good night.